Government fails, the world's off its rails, leaders are whacked, democracy is under attack. It's time to get smart, folks, time to get real. Let's cut through the crap, tell us how you feel. Let's cue the talent, let's meet the host. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back to another podcast by George. We've got a special guest on today's show, well known across the state of Iowa, certainly. It's Laura Belin, and she's the editor, the person behind Bleeding Heartland. And I thought maybe I'd start off by reading a little bit of her bio, and that'll kind of give us a jumping off point here. And like I said, people in Iowa are well aware of this. It's a community blog about Iowa politics, especially campaigns and elections, state government, social, and environmental issues. Bleeding Heartland also covers presidential policies and what the Iowans in Congress are up to, and we talk about that all the time on Podcast by George. And writing as Des Moines Dem, Laura Belin joined the team on Bleeding Heartland in April of 2007 and has been the primary author and sole editor since 2008. Now, she continues to use the handle Des Moines Dem and through 2018 now writes about Iowa politics under her own byline. I really like this, Laura. Found her love of politics growing up with parents and siblings who discussed current events at the dinner table. Welcome on into a Podcast by George.
Thanks for having me, George. I appreciate it.
And that part about your family. Now, I'm getting to be a pretty old boy here. I remember your father, David Belin. He's referred to as the junior counsel on the Warren Commission, right?
Yeah. Yes, he was one of they had 8 counsel on the Warren Commission, and he was one of them. We're surprised to learn I was raised by a Republican.
Well, we talk about the significance of the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission on the podcast. I've had Gerald Posner on, who wrote one of the authoritative books on that, Case Closed. And the way that I put it to people is the significance of that can't be overstated, because if you believe that dark, shadowy forces were at work to assassinate a president of the United States, whether you think it was the mafia, the FBI, the CIA, whatever you might think, if you believe that, your entire perspective, your entire life has been forever changed. And I've told people this before. Now, that's kind of been like a little, maybe a hobby of mine. I took a college course in it. I've read all the books. I've seen the film. I've listened and watched the recordings. And I'm here to tell you, folks, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. He was not part of a conspiracy. It was one nut with a gun. And it shows you the power and significance of one nut with a gun in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. I've been there. It's completely possible. He did do it. You could throw a rock out of that window and hit somebody in a car. That's how close it was. And so anyway, your dad was right. That comes as no surprise to you.
If you're interested in the topic, Gerald Posner's book is great, but there was a really good book published in 2013 for the 50th anniversary by Philip Sheenan, who was a former New York Times investigative reporter. It was called A Cruel and Shocking Act. And part of it is a story of the Kennedy assassination, but really it's more of a history of the Warren Commission, and it's really well researched and detailed. So if you're a buff, that's a book that a lot of people I found don't know about, and it's a very interesting book. I learned a lot from it.
Well, that's great. And I've also got Vincent Bugliosi's the definitive work. The book is this wide,
sure.
Reclaiming History. And,
Yeah.
Posner's perspective on it was people just didn't look closely enough at Oswald. If they understood Oswald, they would understand what happened. Bugliosi's perspective, a lot of it was people didn't look closely enough at the Warren Commission and the work by your father and the other commissioners, and they would better understand that. And now, maybe that to close this off, I didn't want to talk about the JFK assassination, but that's what happens once in a while.
Yeah.
I tell people
Anyway.
that if there was something to this, if we could find one little bit of a conspiracy after all these years, if I could have discovered and proven something like that, I wouldn't be doing Podcast by George right now. It would be the CBS Evening News with George A. Clark. I'm telling you,
Right.
There ain't nothing there, folks. I wish there was. I wished I could have found it. Well, anyway, I wanted to get to Bleeding Heartland. I wanted to get to a couple of stories. We wanted to have you on here a day or two ago. We weren't able to do that because things are kind of hot and heavy here in the state of Iowa with the governor's office right now. Governor Kim Reynolds just came out with a proclamation. She signed something regarding the voting rights and restoring voting rights to felons. Tell us about that.
It's an executive order on voting rights. Yes, she signed that. So that is going to mean that everyone who has completed a felony sentence, which includes a term of prison, parole, probation, those people can automatically get their voting rights back as soon as they completed that sentence. And so it was a very positive thing. I mean, I'm not a fan of Governor Reynolds, but this is definitely one of the best things she's ever done. And there's a lot of work to do still because her executive order doesn't actually add anyone to the voter rolls. People still have to go and register to vote. People have to get the word out that they're allowed to register to vote and help them navigate that process. But in theory, 30, 40,000 people who otherwise wouldn't have been able to vote this November should be able to. And that was really good news.
Well, make me feel better because people that follow the podcast, they know I'm a real lefty, Laura. I'm out on the left fringe of this thing, and I look at Reynolds doing this right now, and I'm immediately cynical and suspicious, always. That's kind of my background, the way that I am. But I look at this as one of those political magic acts, and you've seen it on the national stage. A lot of viewers have. There's domestic issues and problems for a president at home. They reach out into the foreign affairs arena and kind of divert everybody's attention over there. I looked at this Reynolds thing and thought, after all this time, why now? Is this a case of, watch my left hand while my right hand is doing something over here? Do you see any of that in this action?
Well, several people had that same thought because she had a rather disastrous press conference on Tuesday. And then all of a sudden on Wednesday morning, they announced she was signing this order. I mean, in fairness, she did say in June that she was going to sign this voting rights executive order sometime this summer. So it didn't completely come out of nowhere. I was hoping she would sign it sooner. A lot of people were hoping she would sign it around the 4th of July, which is when Governor Vilsack signed his order. But it could be that she had this thing in her pocket and she was ready to pull it out when she needed a good news cycle, or it could be that this thing was only just ready this week. I don't know the answer to that, but I know that you're not the only one who had that thought about, is she trying to distract from this disastrous school reopening plan that if she doesn't have any data to support the approach that she's taking.
Well, as I mentioned at the onset, this isn't your first spin around the mulberry bush. You've been watching this for a long time. Iowa politics, national politics, world politics. You've been around the globe really covering issues. What do you think about this Kim Reynolds situation? The way I put it to people on the podcast is I can't hardly watch her on television. My wife watches all that stuff. I come by and I look at that and I think, my God, is this political, what this woman is doing in the midst of an economic and health emergency and crisis? The political games that are being played by our governor on this school closing issue that you talked about, to me, is shocking and appalling. But are you at this juncture beyond that, being, shocked?
I do find this upsetting. I mean, I was watching the governor's press conferences. She was having press conferences almost every weekday for a couple of months, and I was watching all of those. And I would say each press conference had at least 2 or 3 moments where I was sort of shouting at the computer screen, "What are you doing?" Because it doesn't seem like her approach has been very evidence-based throughout this whole thing. But the school opening is especially upsetting because the consensus for public health people is that you really don't want to reopen schools if the positive test rate is coming back at above 5%. In fact, some people think it really should be below 3% or closer to 1% before you're opening schools. And the governor's idea, I mean, almost the whole state has a positivity rate higher than 5% now. But her idea is that you couldn't even ask permission to close the schools unless the positivity rate is 3 times that, at 15%. And then yesterday, she was talking about some of the counties that have a very high rate. One of them is Webster County, where Fort Dodge is. They have over a 22% positivity rate. But she said, oh, well, most of that is an outbreak at the prison. And so that's very contained. It's not going to affect the community context. Well, who works at a prison, right?
That's great.
They
Yeah.
don't stay all the time at a prison. Hundreds of people work at prisons, and then they go live in the community, they shop, they live with household members who have other jobs. So the idea that the Webster County outbreak is contained is really it's like a fantasy, and it worries me that she's wanting kids to be going back to school in those conditions. I think we're just going to have an explosion.
Well, and like I say, I greatly admire your background and experience. You're a lot smarter than I am. When it comes to school, here's the way that I put it to people. To me, the most important part of school is like kindergarten through 6th grade or so, maybe 7th grade. Those kids are going to learn just fine online. They want to learn. They're like sponges. They'll soak it up. They'll get it. It can be done online. Now, just drawing on my own personal experience, Laura, from about 7th or 8th grade on, I don't know if I learned anything. I got to tell you something. I was one of those incorrigibles in class. Now, there are some kids that maybe need that hands-on training, but I think for whatever good they can get out of it, they probably can get it online. At least that was my experience back in the day. Maybe things have changed a little bit, but from my days in school, what I learned in 11th and 12th grade wasn't worth risking a sniffle over, let alone death.
Right.
I mean, and that's kind of the cynical, grumpy old guy way that I look at this situation with the schools. And the elephant in the room is, you think, well, why would Reynolds be so adamant about why such a peculiar perspective on this? Well, to me, it seems to be linked politically, but I look at everything kind of through a political spectrum. This kind of looks to me like she's lining up with the Trump administration, and this seems to be politics as usual for the Republican Party, and it seems to be a giant political smokescreen. Am I being too harsh?
I don't think so. I think it is highly political. I mean, I think that she likes the idea of people getting back to their normal lives and not being so worried. She seems to not like that people are very anxious about the pandemic. And I do think that she's aligned herself closely with Trump. I mean, in early April, she was saying, well, we're going to not open things up until after we've passed our peak. And then Trump said he wanted to see states starting to open up on May 1st. And that's exactly what she ended up doing, opened up most of the state on May 1st. And even though there was no evidence at that time that we had passed a peak. So I think that there is a little bit of cynicism that's justified. I feel that there are a lot of mixed messages all through this thing. There have been a lot of mixed messages coming through from her press conferences. And most recently, she's had this public relations campaign about Step Up, Mask Up, Iowa thing, which is, if you really want people to wear masks in public, then you kind of need them to be a little bit worried about what happens if they don't. But on the other hand, she's saying, well, I think we can't have all this anxiety, and we have to get back to our lives, and we have to learn how to manage this virus. So I think she can't really decide, because if it's safe to go back to our normal lives and have kids in school, then why would people feel like it's important to consistently wear a mask?
Exactly. And when I look at it, my wife in particular, again, she watches all this stuff. God love her. She's got the patience of Job. But she can't understand why the Republicans are like this. I look at it and I kind of put it in my own little personal context. I remember back when I was doing police and fire reporting, I was the assignment editor at WHO. And I remember business people in particular would be really up in arms and angry about the fact that we would be announcing closures because of snow and blizzards and weather situations like that, because of the effect that it had on business, that people wouldn't go and patronize businesses. And I look at Reynolds doing this, and I think, God, this is all about business. She may get to these points to where masks are mandatory and places are locked down and that type of thing, but she doesn't want to get there until she comes kicking and screaming at the last possible minute, because a business could do some business up until that time. And I think that really is what it's all about. Well, before we lose you, again, I only get to 20, 30 minutes on these podcasts. I wanted to hit, you've had a couple of blockbuster stories here, Laura. I mean, that made the national worldwide stage here in just the past week or so. And it's all related to this political situation and our governor. And I'm going to read this here. This is the open of one of your stories here earlier this week. Exclusive. Iowa State Medical Director receives a 45% pay raise. And it reads, the base pay for Iowa's medical director and state epidemiologist Dr. Caitlin Pedati increased by 45% as the current fiscal year began on July 1. Records obtained by Bleeding Heartland show. The additional $3,144 that Pedati began receiving per 2-week pay period would translate to an extra $81,744 in base salary over 12 months. Now, here's the other thing that jumped out at me. The doctor leading the state's COVID-19 pandemic response has also received more than $55,000 in overtime pay from March through early June, even though her job class would not normally be eligible for overtime compensation. Okay, so again, I put it in my context. Well, wait a minute, this is a salaried employee. I was a salaried employee. You don't get overtime, particularly overtime for things that are part of your normal job assignment, things that you're expected to do. This is the state medical director. I mean, they should be on the job working a little overtime. We're in the midst of a pandemic that are killing people by the scores statewide. What's up with this thing? And I look at this, here comes my cynicism, Laura, and I think, is this political? Is she wanting to reward people that are supporting her perspective and point of view on this politically? Is that what is behind this? Or does she legitimately believe that this person deserves that type of above and beyond compensation at this time?
Well, I tell you, that story, my dad used to say, you make your own luck. And that was an example of it, because I wasn't really investigating the overtime pay. I had no idea that she got a raise. I mean, I obtained the records that show that she got this huge raise in the process of trying to find out more information about her overtime. But, I had the same reaction as you when I had gotten a tip that the governor waived rules on who's eligible for overtime as part of her COVID-19 emergency proclamations. And I went, these proclamations are very long. Some of them have 100 or 150 sections in them. And I went and looked, and lo and behold, there was a paragraph I hadn't seen before and I looked, and that continues to be extended, that there are state rules on who's eligible for overtime. And of course, normally salaried people are not eligible for overtime. And when you think about people who might be getting overtime pay during the pandemic, I think about people who are out there conducting the tests or doing the contact tracing, or people who are putting in extra hours, not a salaried employee kind of managing it from the Department of Public Health. So I then wanted to ask, these are all public records, how much state employees are paid. So I was able to ask, and then the amounts were shocking for some of the people. Dr. Pedati was the most, but there were a number of people, employees, senior employees at the Department of Public Health, who have earned more than $25,000 or $30,000 already in just a few months of the pandemic. And that's an awful lot. And I was not able to get any questions answered about that before I published, but after I published, Tony Lays of the Des Moines Register got an interview with the Department of Public Health director. I should add, a lot of the state employees don't really talk to me the way they talk to other journalists. But she did give an interview to the Des Moines Register, and she said, oh, well, that's not state budget money. That's money from FEMA for crisis funds. And then my next question is, why are we using FEMA crisis funds for senior employees? Like, to me, that doesn't seem like, I would think, again, FEMA crisis funds would be more like for the people on the front line,
yes,
doing the work that we need done. And everyone says we don't have enough contact tracing. We're not turning around the tests fast enough. So let's get more people out there doing that.
Outrageous. It always goes back for me to the original CARES package. They opened up the purse. They shot the money bazooka at the biggest multinational corporations, many of which don't pay taxes, don't even have their headquarters here in the United States. It was the biggest trickle-down scheme in the history of mankind, basically, and the Democrats voted unanimously for it. Drove me crazy. And now we look at this, and Laura, I've coined this little phrase. When it comes to crises like this, I tell people that when the earth quakes, out of the ground come snakes. And that's the way that I look at this. I look at the CARES package that way, and I look at this on a smaller scale, individually that way. Why would we be, with everything that's going to be short here, money-wise. Why would we be dispersing money like this in a health and economic crisis, the likes of which the country and the state have never seen before?
Well, and I also feel that increasing Dr. Padotti's base pay by that amount is just ridiculous when objectively Iowa's not performing very well. The White House Coronavirus Task Force says we're in the red zone.
Yes.
I mean, our cases are increasing, our hospitalizations are increasing, and our deaths are increasing. So if she were doing a really great job, if we were one of the top states for managing it, then sure, a little bit of a raise, but not 45% raise. And the new department director said, well, this is going to put her pay more in line of what the previous state epidemiologist was earning. But Dr. Patricia Quinlisk had that position for 24 years before she retired. And Dr. Padotti has only been working for the state for a couple of years. So I don't really see that she should immediately be earning the salary that her predecessor was earning after more than 2 decades. Her predecessor was a nationally recognized expert in infectious disease, which Dr. Padotti is not. She's a pediatrician by training.
Well, and I'm going to put out a chit here and maybe call it in later. I'm going to have to wrap this podcast up. But God, I love talking to you. And folks, I want to tell you something. You need to follow Bleeding Heartland. You need to look at this independent media. You need to get your sources of information from someplace other than the corporate news outlets that are owned by 6 major corporations, 90% of them in this country. If Laura hadn't reported this, I don't know that it would have been known, because it was deep in the weeds, folks. And sometimes this stuff is, and you got to go there to get it. And she got it. So Laura, good on you. And thanks for coming on a podcast by George.
Appreciate it, George. Anytime.
Anything in closing now before I lose you? Anything that I haven't asked about? Because that happens once in a while. I overlook something, or something that you thought you were going to get to say on this podcast that I didn't get to.
Well, one thing I have my eye on is a story I reported last Friday, which is that Van Buren County Hospital, which is in a small southeast Iowa county, they have a rapid testing. It's called an antigen testing machine. It turns around the results in 15 to 30 minutes. And those positive results on that kind of machine are not being counted by the Iowa Department of Public Health. So that's leading to a discrepancy in how many cases are reported for that county. And I'm trying to find out how many other counties have that similar discrepancy due to the kind of equipment they're using to test people in their communities for COVID-19.
There you go. Hot off the press, folks. You don't get that anywhere else. But Laura Belin, daughter of David Belin and editor of Bleeding Heartland, and a new friend of Podcast by George. And folks, if you like this kind of insight, please, subscribe to us on YouTube and like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter. Subscribe on iTunes and Spotify and all those kinds of places, and get each and every episode. But we're going to close up shop for today. That's going to do it. That's another podcast by George.